You need to define what a mindset is. I think most of us think we know what a mindset is. We think, oh, it's kind of a mental stance where we are positive or we are negative or we believe something or we don't believe something. But a mindset actually has a very specific definition. And here I'm referring to the definition provided by Dr. Ali Crum. Ali Crum is also a professor of psychology at Stanford. She runs her own laboratory working on stress-related mindsets and other mindsets. She's actually been a guest on this podcast previously. Highly recommend you listen to that episode if you haven't already. Dr. Crum defines a mindset as, quote, mental frame or lens selectively organizes and encodes information. I think the key thing to highlight there is organizes information, because as you all well know, we are constantly being bombarded with information from the outside world, sensory information about what's going on with our visual system, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're feeling. We are also bombarded with internal sensations of how full or empty our gut feels. Are we hungry? Are we tired? Are we anxious? Are we calm? Etc. So tons and tons of information funneling into our brain. And mindsets really help us organize that information such that we pay attention to certain things and not others. We respond to certain things and not others. Okay, so here I'm not trying to put additional language on something simple in order to make it complex. I'm trying to put a little bit of language. That is that a mindset does many things, but mainly organizes information. I'll add to that 4 specific actions or inactions in a way that allows us to simplify our world, in a way that allows us to make certain choices and do away with thinking about and acting on other types of information. The other thing about mindsets is that they include entire narratives. And most of the time, we aren't even aware of how those narratives are operating. Meaning, we don't walk around looking at opportunities in the world, the opportunity to get better at fitness or a sport or music or arithmetic or languages or anything for that matter, thinking, okay, what is my mental frame or lens that selectively organizes and encodes information? We don't do that. Instead, what we have are stories. And those stories are usually attached to our sense of identity. Like, just use myself, for instance. I do not think of myself as a good musician. In fact, I can't read music. I'm terrible at playing instruments. I like listening to music. I consider myself a terrible musician. I've really assigned a value, or I've assigned my value to music and my relationship to music. Right? We tend to do that. You can also do it in the opposite direction. Right? I've been running a laboratory for a long time, in science for close to 3 decades. So if you ask me, I feel proficient at science, I'd say, yeah, I'm proficient at science. I know how to do experiments, set up experiments, research papers, write grants, etc. Pretty good at it, right? We tend to decide if we are good or bad at things, and we tend to integrate those with our identity somewhat or a lot, depending on whether or not we're a professional or amateur, or how much we engage in an activity. The point being that mindsets include all of these narratives. Often those narratives are visible to us if we think about them, but most of the time we are moving through the world, meaning school, work, relationships, and all our endeavors without a lot of careful thought about the narratives we carry. And the beauty of growth mindset is that it forces us to step back and ask ourselves some simple questions. These are questions that you could ask yourself right now, and in fact, I highly recommend you do. You could ask yourself, for instance, what have I been told I'm really good at? You should also ask yourself, what have I been told I'm really poor at, that I'm just not good at? What have I told myself I'm really good at? And what have I told myself I'm really bad at? And then a second set of questions is, what am I good at and why? Did it come naturally to me? Did I apply myself for many years? Meaning, did I apply a lot of effort learning that thing? Perhaps both, right? And then it's also important to ask yourself, why am I not good at other things? Is it simply because you've never applied yourself at those things? Or is it because you tried and had an early failure? Or perhaps you tried and tried and tried for many years and you continued to fail at that thing, or you just didn't reach a level of proficiency that made you want to pursue it further. In asking yourselves those questions, you are asking yourself not just what you're good at and bad at and why. You should also be thinking about where the messages of being good at something, being bad at something arrived from. They arrive from outside you, meaning from your parents, from your coaches, from your teachers, or was it the case that despite a lot of positive feedback, you just sort of decided you weren't good at something? Or conversely, was it the case that despite a lot of negative feedback that you would never be good at something, or that you weren't good at something, that you continue to persist? Because there are certainly people like that. The more negative feedback they get, the more they dig their heels in to prove themselves as capable of becoming good at something. So I do recommend, as we march forward in this conversation, you think about those questions. What am I good at? What am I bad at? Why am I good at those things? Why am I bad at those things? And ask yourself to what extent your labels, that is your identity, is attached to things that you are good at, bad at. And the reason I'd like you to ask yourself those questions is that next we're going to talk about some research from Dr. Carol Dweck's laboratory that was really the seed of the entire field of growth mindset. It relates to a specific set of experiments that really show the specific feedback we get, meaning whether or not we get feedback that is attached to our identity, like a label, like smart or great athlete or talented, sends us down a very different path of performance in the short and long run, as compared to whether or not we receive feedback that's based on effort, meaning you tried really hard or you really seem to apply yourself under conditions where you're getting the right answer over time because you simply refuse to quit. Those are two very divergent sets of feedback. And as you'll learn in a moment, sorts of feedback that we get, especially early in life or early in an endeavor. So this doesn't just apply to young kids. This applies to adults too, who are taking on a new skill or are trying to expand on an existing skill. Those two divergent forms of feedback get integrated into our core beliefs about what we think is possible for us in a given endeavor. And the great news is, we can also modify those core beliefs simply by changing the feedback that we give ourselves. A research paper I'd like to discuss briefly beautifully embodies the runway that led to the discovery of growth mindset is a paper from Dr. Carol Dweck as well as her colleague Claudia Mueller. And the title of the paper essentially says it all. The title is Praise for Intelligence Can Undermine Children's Motivation and Performance. That should be surprising. Praise for intelligence can undermine motivation and performance. I would have thought, and I think many people will probably believe, that if you tell a child or an adult they're really good at something and you're genuine about that feedback, meaning they're performing well, and you say, hey, you're doing really well, you're so smart, you're so talented, that their performance would continue to improve, that it would bolster their motivation to engage in that activity, which hopefully they enjoy. But regardless, provided that it's a safe activity, it's educational, what have you, that it would serve to encourage them. Right? Kid thinks, not only am I engaging in this activity, but I'm getting positive feedback, presumably from people that I care about or whose opinion I care about. Wouldn't that serve to elevate performance? It does not. In fact, the exact opposite happens. So I'll just give you a few of the key takeaways from this study. The way it was done is very interesting. They essentially gave feedback about performance that was linked up with child's intelligence. Telling kid they're smart, they're talented, that they can learn things really easily, or that they're very good at learning, this sort of thing. And they called that intelligence feedback. Or they gave them what was called effort feedback. Simple way to think about effort feedback is that it's more attached to verbs as opposed to labels. So effort feedback consists of things like, you tried really hard on that problem. It was great the way that you applied effort. It was great the way that you persisted. It was great the way that even when you got the wrong answer, you spent 10 minutes thinking about it and then you tried again and again. Or in some cases, even if they didn't get the right answer, telling them, well, even though you didn't get the right answer, it's really terrific that you continue to try. Okay, so intelligence feedback was the sort of feedback that was tied to labels of identity, things like smart, talented, etc. Whereas effort feedback is tied to verbs, choices, behavioral and cognitive choices that children made in an effort to learn or get better at something. So in this study, which included over 100 children, they either got the intelligence type feedback or the effort type feedback, or was a control group that didn't get either intelligence or the effort type feedback. And then they looked at a number of different outcomes. So I'll just highlight a few examples of what they found. First of all, the kids that got the intelligence-based feedback, when they were then later offered problem sets that were either challenging or were the sort that they knew they could perform well on, they tended to select problems that they knew they could perform well on. These were what were referred to as performance goals. In other words, they picked problems that allowed them to continue to get the praise that they had received previously about being smart or talented. Whereas the kids that got feedback about their strong effort, when later presented with problems that were either easy or hard, more often than not, they picked the harder problems that stood to teach them more. That's striking. It says that if you tell a kid that they're smart or talented, and that's the reason why they perform well, and they encounter challenges, they are likely to go with the least amount of challenge so that they can continue to receive that praise or feedback. Whereas if you receive praise and feedback for your strong effort, then later you tend to pick environments, problem sets, etc., that allow you to exert the very effort that got you the praise in the first place. So in both cases, these children are essentially attached to the praise, right, in some sense. I mean, we like to think that they enjoy these activities and they're benefiting from them as well. But in both cases, the praise really serves to reinforce a certain pattern of behavior. But in the case of giving intelligence feedback, the kids are really just trying to reinforce being told that they're smart or talented, as opposed to reinforcing the engagement in the activity that got them the praise in the first place. And the converse is also true. When kids are told, hey, you really tried hard, and that's great, or I like how you persisted, or you're so persistent, I can really see how persistent you are in trying to get the right answer, even if you don't get the right answer. Then when you present those kids with additional challenges, they work very hard to stay in challenge. And guess what? No surprise. Kids that are rewarded for effort and that continue to pick harder problems outperform the kids that are given the intelligence praise and feedback by a large margin. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the narratives that we hear from others, of course, reinforce certain patterns of behavior. What else does this tell us? This tells us that if you're a parent or teacher, you have to be very careful about giving feedback to a child that is attached to their identity around an endeavor, especially if they're performing well at that endeavor. Of course, if a child is not performing well at something, you also don't want to tell them that they're stupid, right? You don't want to tell them that they're efficient, right? But that's a rare occurrence in the classroom, one would hope. It's a rare occurrence on the field, one would hope. But what's very common, very, very common, is that when we see children or adults performing well, we tend to give them identity labels as a way to try and reinforce whatever behavior we observe and we like. The other thing they looked at in this study, besides whether or not these kids would pick hard or easier challenges down the line, were actual raw performance on cognitive problems. And these data, I must say, are just so interesting. They took the kids and they gave them all the same problem sets. And all the kids across the board, whether or not they were getting intelligence praise or effort praise or they were in the control group, were performing more or less the same way. We're getting some of these questions right, some of these questions wrong. Then they gave them praise after they completed those problems. They either got intelligence praise, you're so smart, you're so talented, or they got effort praise. You tried so hard, you really persisted, that's fantastic. And later they gave them another set of problems and they looked at performance. Now remember, first time around, all the kids got some of the questions right and some of the questions wrong. So there's room for improvement for everybody. What they found was absolutely striking. Kids that were in the control group, so they didn't get any specific form of praise, they performed more or less the same way as they did before. If they were getting 75% the answers right the first time, they got 75% of the answers right second time, 25% wrong in both cases. Kids that were in the intelligence praise group, the you're so smart, you're so talented praise group, their performance went down significantly. Whereas kids that were in the effort praise group, their performance increased significantly. Okay, so this is a bi-directional effect where giving intelligence praise reduces performance, giving effort praise improves performance, which is absolutely striking and tells you everything you need to know, which is you're a parent, you're a teacher, and of course, we all give ourselves feedback. Rewarding yourself for effort is the best way to improve performance. Rewarding yourself based on identity labels, so smart, so talented, you're a great athlete, etc. All that stare in the mirror and do self-affirmation stuff can actually undermine performance, and in fact, does undermine performance. It may not do it right away, eventually it does. And in a moment,